We are the Group 4 and we will report about the 1973 OPEC oil price shock crisis. Our agenda is to discuss the background of the problem, the cause of the crisis, the indicators that there is a crisis, the response of the government, assessment whether the response is effective or not, and for the concluding statement. Oil is one of the biggest drivers of energy, especially in the industrial economy. Therefore, any form of oil crisis can lead up to severe economic and political instability. So, what is really oil crisis? It is defined as a sharp increase in the oil price supplemented by a sudden decrease in the oil supply. So, depending on the severity of the crisis, it can debilitate the global economy. So, one of the biggest historically relevant oil crises is the 1973 oil crisis or the 1973 OPEC oil embargo.
Here's the background of the problem. During the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, Arab members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries or OPEC forced a ban against the United States in reprisal for the US choice to resupply the Israeli military and to acquire influence in the post-war peace negotiations. The Arab OPEC members also extended the ban to other different nations that upheld or support the Israel, including the Netherlands, Portugal, and South Africa. So the ban both restricted petroleum exports to the designated countries and presented cuts in oil production. Several years of negotiations between oil producing nations and oil companies had already destabilized a decades old pricing system, which exacerbated the embargo's effect. In 1971, President Richard Nixon provoked the ban when he decided to remove the United States from the gold standard. In result, the nations could no longer reclaim the US dollars in their foreign exchange reserves for gold. With this action, Nixon went against the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement. His move sent the cost of gold skyrocketing. The history of the gold standard uncovers this was unavoidable. In any case, Nixon's action was so abrupt and unforeseen that it likewise sent the value of the dollar down. The falling worth of the dollar hurt OPEC nations. They rely upon the petrodollar for their government revenues. Their oil contracts were valued in US dollars, and that implied their revenue fell alongside the dollar. The cost of imports that were named in different currencies remained the same or rose. And OPEC even thought about pricing oil in gold rather than dollars to keep the revenue from disappearing. On October 19, 1973, Nixon requested $2.2 billion from Congress in emergency military assistance for Israel. The Arab members of OPEC answered by stopping oil commodities to the United States and other Israeli partners. Egypt, Syria, and Israel announced a truce on October 25, 1973. OPEC proceeded with the ban until March 1974, and by then, at that point, oil prices had soared from $2.90 per barrel to $11.65 per barrel.
The 1973 to 1975 economic recession was widely attributed to the oil embargo during 1973. So, the government measures in the United States to the previous problems contributed to the recession and stagflation that followed. The OPEC embargo showcased the cartel's growing influence in the global economy, and many Americans saw it as another indication of their country's collapse in the 1970s. So these are the oil crisis indicators and its effects. The impact was felt by the American customers in their wallets as retail gasoline prices increased by 40% in November 1973 alone. The November cut equated to approximately 5 million barrels per day, so this decrease in production served as a primary catalyst for the 1973 to 1974 fourfold spike in oil pricing from US dollars to 12 dollars per barrel. So American queued up at the pump to refuel, fearful of gasoline shortages as gas stations raise their prices many times every day. So the gas queues revealed the hysteria that gripped the country during the embargo, as drivers feared that if they did not fill up today, the price might rise tomorrow. So with heavy demand, several stations ran out of gas, and placards proclaiming "Sorry, no gas today" became a common scenario in the late fall months. So in the US, gas prices rose 37% and widespread rationing became part of everyday life throughout the 1973 and 1974. The aggregate impact proved significant, estimated to have shrunk US economic output for the period by 2.5%. The OPEC embargo generated a global energy scarcity, so which had a significant influence on the United Kingdom and the United States of America. It ensured gasoline shortages to the nation and skyrocketing prices followed. So during the same period, rising energy prices were a vital component to an intense recession felt in the UK. So, amidst the fuel shortages and extreme transportation costs, the UK experienced an inflation rate topping 24%.
As for the government response regarding with the OPEC oil embargo, price controls and rationing was implemented. The solution was to limit the price of the old oil while newly discovered oil are put in higher price. This was also with the intent to promote oil exploration, which occurred in several countries. Furthermore, in the United States, automobiles with odd numbers in the last of their plates were permitted to buy gasoline in odd days of the month. Also, in even-numbered plates are also permitted to buy gasoline on even-numbered days of the month as well. The monetary policy during those times responded not so well. The monetary expansion has gradually slowed down. The Federal Reserve restrained the money growth and permitted interest rates to rise sharply in the few months of 1974. Officials has also said that in order to avert depression, inflation must be decreased. However, the unavoidable cost of this was the modest rise of unemployment rate.
Assessment of the response. The effectiveness of the government responses was not distinct and consistent at first. Worldwide cooperation was demanded to the international and national government to reduce domestic consumption. So they opted to reduce oil imports by industrial nations to counter OPEC pricing decisions. Also, they prioritizes market adjustment from the very beginning of the crisis. So the US attempted to reduce adjustment costs as much as possible. However, by the end of the decade, the US response to the 1973 crisis is by reducing oil price that later on has signaled a successful exploration and a viable solution to the crisis. Policy changes implemented. When OPEC cut production in November 1973, government leaders and American public were concerned about the foreign oil producers' ability to influence domestic life. President Richard Nixon instituted a rationing program intended to safeguard American oil prices and ensure continued low prices. The rationing program had more drastic effects at home than the OPEC. During the Nixon and Carter administration, they proposed to increase gasoline taxes in order to generate revenue from the loss they encountered during the crisis. However, 60% of the consumers preferred rationing and 25% preferred an increase in fuel taxes, and 15% still undecided.
In conclusion, in the 1973 Arab-Israel War, Arab members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries or OPEC imposed a restriction on the US. Was the retaliations of the United States' decisions to resupply the Israel military and again leverage in the peace talks. The prohibitions was also extended to the other countries that supported Israel, such as the Netherlands, Portugal, and the South Africa. By Arab OPEC members oils shipments to the targeted nations wherein prohibited, the oil output was reduced as a result of the prohibition. Although the government react to the oil shock was widely regarded as the policy failure, it was a part of wider pattern of the national adjustment to the global economy. A feeble officials in the administrative were in the simply seeking for effective energy adjustment tactics that they also wanted to know what approaches and the tools the government might utilize. That's all for our organizations of petroleum exporting countries, oil price in 1973. Thank you so much for watching and listening.